Hi there, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, UX and the Smart City, a transformational tool in urban design. It's part of BrightTALK's IoT in the Connected Economy Summit. My name is Helena Hill. I am a speaker, consultant and coach based here in the UK. I talk specifically about UX design, user experience design, that is, service design, customer experience and digital transformation. I work on a cross-sector basis, helping organisations become more user-centred in their approach to development, innovation and customer journey planning. So the key takeaways from today are we'll be discussing the concept of a smart city. What is it? What does it consist of? The concept of user experience design and its role as a transformational tool. Exploring examples of emerging technology that demand UX input for success, cities already bridging the gap between UX and urban design, a simple UX framework for testing and collecting feedback from the people, and then finally, where do we go from here? What does the future hold in terms of IoT and smart city planning and urban design? So first of all, what we'd like to discuss really is what is a smart city? So I did a little bit of research around this. There seems to be an awful lot of definitions out there at the moment being bandied about what a smart city actually is. But I felt that this was one of the best, and this comes from an author called Martin Tomich. And he says that a smart city is a city that improves the life of its citizens by augmenting existing services and infrastructure through digital technology. And there are various components to a smart city. And generally they consist of one or more of the following, and they are data and analytics, IoT, which is short for Internet of Things, sensors, which then collect that data, whether they be on lampposts, whether they be parking sensors, air quality sensors, city apps, which is what generally citizens of a city will use via a device, such as a mobile phone. Other components would be a smart transportation, e-governance, smart health, smart manufacturing, and smart buildings. And smart buildings actually are a topic, I would say, probably actually on their own in terms of, I could do another full presentation just on smart buildings themselves. But they make up, and they are an important component of what is gradually now becoming known as the smart city. And those components actually come together with the aim to actually do something, to create these three things. So what they do is they turn that data, they collect that data, and maybe even things like autonomous vehicles as well, into something a lot more meaningful for citizens. And this diagram here from our technology focuses on the three things that the smart city really should represent, the three pillars of what represents a smart city. And they are a clean environment, so handle global environmental urbanization problems, for example, the happiness of citizens and also visitors to that city as well, and their lifestyle, the quality of lifestyle, and thirdly, sustainability. So it's designed to ensure the flexible, dynamic approach needed to ensure the sustainable existence of a city. And they are the three things that make up what a smart city is. But they need those previous components that I showed you to allow this to actually happen. So that's a very kind of short introduction into what a smart city is made up of generally, or one or more of those things, and what actually it's meant to achieve. So moving forward then, this is a question that I am asked almost on a daily basis. I'm usually asked it in one of several ways, but it's along the lines of what is UX? And I usually get asked, what do you do? And UX, again, it's very much like the smart city in terms of how you can go about various definitions. But the definition that I tend to sort of come back to is one from a very famous organisation called the Nielsen-Norman Group. And user experience here encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with a company, its services and its products. And that's where a lot of my work comes in. is that I tend to work with organisations, whether it be improving a service or a product or even a process, to help them, users, become happier using it, and therefore improving the bottom line generally. So why is it that some services and products fail? And generally, the reason for that is whether you're a smart city trying to improve, or you're a website trying to, you're the owner of a website trying to convert more visitors, is generally because we can be quite inward-looking generally in ourselves. So our way isn't necessarily the right way, or the way that we think we should do things isn't the way necessarily our users think we should do things. We may have put up roadblocks stopping our users from doing what it is that we want them to achieve. We may have made a journey through a city in this context, or from one part of a website to another part of the website, too difficult by putting up roadblocks. We may have added complex processes, something that makes it so difficult that our users actually give up and go somewhere else. And the very crux of this is maybe just not knowing who our users actually are. And this is a mistake that I see, especially when I'm working with startups, of not doing that exploratory work, and not actually finding out who the users are, what their pain points are, and what their requirements are before going ahead and starting to build something out. And if you don't know who your users are, how can you then ask them what it is that they want to achieve? We don't know. So we haven't tested. How can we then move on and actually test our users using the system if, one, we don't know who they are, and secondly, we don't know what their pain points are? So that's generally why I find when I'm working with smaller organisations, they sometimes fail, but necessarily aren't actually working to their full potential because they haven't done this homework. But moving back to smart cities, in the context of smart cities, UX can really provide the why of what it is we're trying to achieve. So UX can help research and urban designers, urban planners and architects research into how cities and spaces are being used and by whom. So again, I'm kind of referring back there to that UX exploratory process that I was talking about. So we can find out who's actually using spaces and then how they're being used. So that's really all about knowing who your audience are. UX can help us identify problems and find opportunities by asking the right people, our users, the right questions. It can help us design interactions and journeys, and lastly, inform how technology is used to improve the quality of life. And in the smart city context, that is extremely important. So who is it that we need to be asking these questions to? Who are the typical stakeholders in the smart city environment? So for example, probably the biggest stakeholder, and often the most difficult actually to talk to and to communicate with, is the citizens. Then we have tech companies, who are often the people behind the technology or creating the sensors, the hardware and the software for smart city development and innovation. Utility companies such as water, electricity and gas. Governments themselves, both national and local governments, and I'll put that underneath there as well, local municipal authorities, for example. Community groups such as parish councils, academic and research institutions, who might find that from collecting the data are able then to use that to inform how we move forward in smart city and urban design. Business, and then of course I've got there lastly, but not least, is planners and urban designers, who can are very much all part of the sort of smart city collection that we have here of stakeholders. So that's kind of generally who they are. So the next question, and probably the hardest question, is how we get them engaged in smart city design. And there's various ways that we can do this. We can use online platforms These are a great opportunity to share ideas and gather feedback, specifically from infrastructure planning, community engagement, and that can be through meetups, community feedback sessions, for example, surveys. Surveys can be an interesting one. We tend to generally now, as users, as humans, suffer from something called survey apathy, very much so. And we kind of getting a little bit sick of filling in large surveys after the fact. And you'll notice what some apps such as Uber have started doing is actually asking for feedback within the app. So rather than the user having to make a separate feedback after using a service, they can actually make it even while they're using it. And that actually really does help, and from my knowledge, actually can increase the amount of feedback on something if you're actually getting the user while they're using something rather than afterwards. Observation is an interesting one. And that can be of how people are using a space, just watching. So for example, when I did my master's degree on town planning, I went to Vancouver for a week and actually sat for about 3 hours in a couple of public spaces and actually just watched how the public, how citizens actually moved through that space, what they stopped to look at, which route they took, for example. And to add to this now, if you put the smart city sort of plug in there as well, what's even more interesting now is what devices are citizens using while they're in these spaces? Because it's those devices that could potentially end up being the link between those centres and the urban planners. They can provide data. Some of the other ones as well, a particularly interesting one is challenges and competitions. And that's actually a great way to get cities and municipalities and local authorities involved in smart city planning and technology as well. So, for example, one of the most recent examples of that happened in Canada just last year, or I should say end of 17 through 18. And the winner actually has just been announced, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And they actually, what they did was they actually put out there a sort of nationwide challenge for smart cities and sort of smart city innovation. And the competitions as well can actually bring in the tech companies. So it's a great way of encouraging collaboration between tech companies, citizens, and local authorities. So those are just some of the ways that we can actually start creating a conversation with the various stakeholders. So we've talked a little bit about UX and what that means in terms of creating a better experience for people. And we've talked about smart cities and some of the components and what it is that we're trying to achieve, those 3 pillars, including happiness was one of them there. So having considered technological advances in smart cities and urban design and that concept of user experience, how can the two work smartly together to improve the experience of citizens? Well, we are now moving towards a relatively new concept, and I think it's a very, very exciting concept of UX urban design, where cities are designed by and for its citizens. And actually, it's not an entirely unexpected merging of the two disciplines, I think, as an urban designer and a UX professional. And in 2015, Paul McConnell and Mike Clare from the company Intersection, I believe they're at intersection.com if you'd like to take a look, they were designing for cities about how growing cities can use design methods and how they can be applied to strategic challenges among citizens, stakeholders and commercial interests as well. So what we're starting to see now is actually the concept of UX, which is making, basically at its very heart, making something better for a user or for the person who's using it. We're starting to see that now kind of move over to the other side of the fence and work in an urban design context, which I think is particularly exciting. So in order to, I guess, what does that UX design, urban design, what does it mean for us in terms of how people are getting involved now? Is we're facilitating sort of empathetic problem solving in a way. We're asking the right questions and we're facilitating discussions. And that can enable us to influence placemaking in communities, inform how technology and the Internet of Things is used, such as city apps and data collection, for example, and with a view really to improving the sustainability of cities and qualities of life, which was one of those 3 pillars that I talked about a little earlier on. And I guess those solutions that we talked about, what those components, those IoT and the sensors and the data, how can that actually all be used in the smart city? What are we talking about here? What does it mean? What does the data mean? What are the sensors for? So here's some examples. For example, we're looking at reducing congestion in cities, improving rubbish collection, improving transportation routes and hubs, encouraging engagement with space, improving safety, being more efficient, improving connectivity between devices and sensors, enabling smart buildings and utility management as well. And here's a few examples here, or 2 or 3 examples of actually what these sensors look like, because that's another question is that have been asked quite recently. What do these sensors actually look like? And actually, they're not too complex really in a way. But what we've got here is an example of a parking sensor. Now, this is something that you would see underneath a parking space, for example, and on a parking space, I should say. And when a car comes up and it parks over the top of it, it knows that a car is there. And once moving off that, it will then communicate to those people who are linked with it via their devices that now that car parking space is free and is available and they can use it. Underneath that, we have an air quality sensor, and to the left of that, a traffic safety sensor. And actually, that's quite interesting, that one, because the City of Portland, actually that's an example from the City of Portland, they're using it not just for traffic. It will help traffic safety, absolutely, but it will also compile information about how people use streets, including where they typically walk, and cyclists also, and how they drive and how they're using streets, and how fast people are driving. So it tends to be not just for safety, but there tends to be sort of, multi-sensors within one sensor. It's quite interesting. And for a moment here, I'm going to just take you out of the city, but you never know, there might be 1 or 2 who have vineyards within their city walls. And IoT has even made its way into the wine industry. And here, as you'll see on this slide, is an example of a vineyard manager looking over his sensor, which he's got there in the middle of his crops, his grapes, and he's looking at the software on his phone. And the kind of software that he might be looking at is, or the kind of data that he might be able to gain from that is, for example, weather and weather predictions and any maintenance work that needs to be done on the vineyard. It's kind of constantly monitoring the state of the vineyard. Advanced stage process to model disease development, for example. So these are the kind of feedback that having that piece of hardware in his vineyard is actually passing back via the software onto his phone or device. So again, I say that's just stepping out of the city for a little moment there, but that's an example of kind of that relationship between the hardware, the software, and the device that the citizen is using. This one here is an example from Oslo in Norway, and they actually have fairly recently put in these street lamps, which are very clever, and actually are dimmed to around about 20% of their normal power until a car or a cyclist or a pedestrian actually start using the road. And then they're boosted up to around 100% before they gradually drop down again. And this is saving cities many thousands in terms of utility bills. And talking of street lamps, this is the kind of IoT in cities that you can expect to see next, where we have sort of the next generation of street lamps, which aren't just lamps, but actually can share things like, for example, digital signage. They may act as a charging point for cars. They have sensors on them as well, and also kind of smart lighting. As an example, just as one that you've just seen there. So this is how sort of normal everyday things that we see on the street now are starting to change, so we can be smarter about the way we live in our lifestyle. This is another example from a company called Grid, who I've actually been recently working with. They're based in Newcastle in the UK here. And one of their innovations is something called Curb. And it's quite interesting in that what it does is it creates certainty of a parking location for delivery vehicles, therefore reducing congestion and emissions. So rather than a delivery vehicle driving round and round in circles, looking for somewhere to park, this actually provides a booking system where a vehicle can actually book a piece of the curb to drop off or collect. They pop in their vehicle registration, the vehicle type, what time they want it, they pay their monies. And this is actually being developed and innovated with the view of really, this is a way of reducing congestion, and also it's much better for the environment to have them drive straight to a place, do the drop off and come out again, than it is to drive around in circles for half an hour. So all this is very, very exciting technology, very, very exciting innovation. The next challenge is actually how we get citizens on board and collect data from them in a way in which they don't feel vulnerable, for example. And Dubai is something called Smart Dubai. Their vision, if you go to their website, their vision is to make Dubai the happiest place on earth. And what they did is they actually released something called the happiness meter. And it's something that citizens can view through their phones. And it's one of Dubai's first strategic smart city initiatives. And what it does is it ranks customer experiences within industry sectors and geographic areas, as well as differentiate between direct and web-based interactions. So people in society are the bedrock of their city, so they say, and so citizens are naturally a key player in the development of any solution that Dubai as a city put forward. So they started this happiness meter to get feedback from people about the city's services. So about some of those things that we were talking about earlier, such as rubbish collection, parking, for example, connectivity. And the system actually allows people to rate different services around the city, and currently gathers more than around about 23,000 votes per day, according to the website, and actually shows a happiness rate of around 90%. So it's a fairly simple user interface, but it's one which is allowing them on a fairly high level still collect data on a city-wide level as to what they can expect and what they can feed back. And the data that they've collected from the app has led to a longer-term plan called Dubai Plan 2021. And it's actually a global roadmap and a benchmark that's going to split these initiatives, the smart city initiatives, over 6 dimensions. So they're going to be concentrating on economy, society, government experience, interestingly has come out as one of them, which is great, and people and place. So just from that fairly straightforward app, that way of giving citizens a way of feeding back on city services, for example, they've already started to build out a much broader plan of where to go next. The next example is one from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, and they have a similar app called VANCONNECT. And they have, again, the app is a similar thing. It's all about improving your community, report an issue and watch it get fixed is what it says there on the interface. And it's a way for citizens to be able to report things that are going on in the neighbourhood, or graffiti, animals, for example. And I know from personal experience that if you live in North Vancouver, you are likely to come across a bear or two. So this is a way of being able to feed that information back to authorities and actually have them act on it. And going back to beforehand, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the Canada Challenge as a way of engaging cities and citizens in the smart city, concept. And in 2017, the Government of Canada actually launched a Smart City Challenge. And for that, the cities of Vancouver and a city just to the south of it called Surrey, they came together to put in a joint bid And the prize was a pretty hefty 50 million Canadian dollars, which the government would put towards, you know, connectivity and hardware and software and paying for this kind of thing. So they put in a joint bid. And the idea was for the city to come together to reach a diverse range of residents and tap the knowledge of the tech industry. So what they did was they came up with an interactive website, which got around 7,500 to 10,000 visits, I believe. They created lots of social media conversation around how they were going to be coming together to improve the lifestyle between the two cities. And now they did use surveys, interestingly, and they got over 2,000 completed, so that's quite impressive. And they, as well as that, they hold lots of community meetings. They had, the public were able to take rides in autonomous vehicles. And they have lots of what we call idea sessions with tech professionals as well. So not only did they come together as two cities, they actually brought the tech industry, the citizens together to try and get something really moving here. Now, unfortunately, they didn't win. I think that the prize went to Montreal. But what they are doing is they're pressing ahead with the ideas that they had. And one of the reasons that they did so well, and they were a finalist actually, is because they kept it very context specific. They kept the very specific to Vancouver and Surrey, just as Dubai did with theirs. And as you'll see, the two examples I gave you were both using city apps. They were both a tool by which citizens could feed back to authorities. And the two things that they did really well is that they did address real challenges such as pollution, such as healthcare, such as sustainability. And they were context specific. They were challenges, they were answering challenges, needs and problems of those cities. You can actually get, any city can buy in a generic city app, but it has to then be made to be for the citizens of that city. And that's so important when it comes to actually creating this. So yeah, the creators of the tech, it has to remain citizen-centric, and I come back to that again about that context, about it being citizen-centric for that city. It must be created to improve livability. That must be really what's at the heart of tech and data and IoT in smart cities. Consideration of devices and environments in which they are being used is very, very important too. It's what sort of devices are people using and feeding back this data from, and where are they using them? And it must be done with community and stakeholder involvement. So talking, involvement in design processes, involving them in how that data will be used. And I'm going to take you across to the east side of Canada now to a project which called Quayside, which is just on the shores of Lake Ontario in Toronto. And this project actually is still ongoing, and some of you may know about it. It has been quite controversial actually. A company called Sidewalk Labs won the tender to put this out. To sort of have put this, to develop this 12-acre site just on the shore of Lake Ontario. Now, it's interesting in that Sidewalk Labs are actually affiliated to Google, but they were commissioned by Waterfront Toronto, which is a public body, and to build this new community from the ground up, which was quite an exciting project. But the public actually were worried about how the data was going to be used. So if they were to move through this 12-acre site, how was that data going to be used? And they didn't feel that they'd been told enough, or that the companies involved have been transparent enough about that. And potentially because they were affiliated to this large organisation, which is known for collecting data, they worried what would happen to that. Might it be sold? Might it be misused, for example? So they are still claiming, or some of them actually, that there has been a lack of transparency and many questions around how that data will be used does actually still remain unanswered. However, as of the 22nd of May, so only a couple of weeks ago, the Star in Toronto was saying that 54% of Torontonians are now supporting the project. And the final master plan, if you're interested to see what should happen with it, is actually due to be released this month. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting one, but that's a more slightly controversial project that has been happening, is happening now almost in real time. So, in conclusion, what we need to do is we need to have this framework from which to drive innovation in cities, as we do with products and services. And at that point there, this is where we bring in that UX that I was talking about right at the beginning. It's providing a framework in which those people who are driving smart cities can move forward and actually plan a way forward with those different stakeholders in mind that we talked about right at the beginning. So the three goals are, for example, quality of life, economic competitiveness, and sustainability. And they, according to the William deInnes and John Scarlin from Deloitte, can provide the foundation for a smart city initiative. So this is an example that I put together about a year ago now, actually. It's a user-centered framework for the future. And what we have to think about is, I think about this in a customer journey context. So if I was designing a customer journey for a product or a service, for example, I would think about how stakeholders would become aware of that product or service. So let's put this in a smart city context. How might they become aware of a plan for a smart city, or the development one, or one sort of starting in a way, I guess. How do they then move through that service into actually what we call purchase points? Now, this isn't a website, it's not an e-commerce website, so we're not talking about purchasing an item. In this context, it's more how would we then actually ask people to get signed up? So it would be a sign up to something, or opting in to share their data, for example, would be the service point in the middle. And then how do we manage those relationships and that data after the fact? Because what we need is this kind of collective intelligence of stakeholders to be able to deliver these services properly. So the pre-tech part, or the pre-IoT, is how do we get people finding out about what's happening? And it might be through word of mouth, might be through public relations, for example. So how are the concepts of the Smart City Initiative being presented to the public? Is it through advertisements? Is it through meetings? Is it through tech meetups, for example? And what are the expectations of stakeholders based on their knowledge of maybe companies that have already been involved in a similar project? And then as we move through to the actual part, is what touch points our customers or users going to have over that service journey? So we need to think about not just getting them on board, but actually how we engage and work with them throughout the whole service. Because what we want is, after they've signed onto something or started using something, we want them to then be advocates for our service. We want them to say to colleagues and friends, you know, I'm using this, I'm sharing my data with a view to improving X. And if we do that, if we turn our users into advocates, then we're starting to get more people on board. And this is an example from Deloitte of a smart city framework. So the one I showed you there is kind of more of a moving from a pre-service through the service, through getting somebody signed up in this context, to how we sort of engage with them and how we retain them afterwards, how we turn them into advocates. This actually is a template from Deloitte, and it's about how we get people involved in the smart city in terms of engagement, collaboration. The transparency there, you'll see, is at the bottom. It's so important. And also inclusion as well. So we can create the wonderful economy, good mobility, security, education, living environment. So it's all to do with how we get people involved in smart cities. And in 2013, actually, if we move on now to where do we go next, I would like to give you an example. In 2013, the City of Amsterdam sought to expand its 11 existing air quality measurement stations. And the city wanted a street level hyperlocal measurement of air quality, I suppose, that the existing infrastructure did not support. So what's more, the existing air quality measurement was too expensive to be scalable. So what they're looking to do in the future is they're going to take a different route, they're going to get more people involved, launching something called the Amsterdam Smart Citizens Lab. And that's where we're starting to move on to. And it brings me on to how we're going to move on here. That there are so many challenges with smart cities. And the biggest one is that rapid urbanization is putting pressure on services and sustainability. So how can more cities like Amsterdam come up with these innovative ideas, for example, creating citizens' labs to start collecting feedback from the people, from stakeholders, as to how we should solve these problems and keep them active, of course, in this problem solving. We're going to see, I think, enabling smarter decision making with collective intelligence. That collective intelligence is not just to come from data and sensors, it's going to come from talking and people. And really, that makes the IoT part, I think, only part of the smart city solution. More examples, I think, as a city as a platform. And that Amsterdam example I gave you then is a smart citizen lab. And also they're encouraging more of their citizens to wear wearable technology. And they're creating it almost like a scientific lab in the city. So they can measure temperature and humidity, light, sound, carbon monoxide, for example. And they're sort of bringing in more and more active participants who can learn how to use that, how to upload that data so the city can make smarter decisions. I think because of this data, we're going to see faster, innovative, data-driven technology. And I talk a lot about data-driven when I'm consulting, actually, which is quite interesting because data is the real thing. It's actually what is happening. It's not our gut feeling. It's not what we think is happening. Data is actually what is happening. And if we can make it so smart cities can make decisions based on actually what they are not just seeing, but what the data is telling them, then the more innovative will be. And I think we're going to see more of the use of blockchain as a payment for city services, for example, an increase in the use of key performance indicators as well to measure success and the impact of smart city initiatives. And that's, again, another, I kind of putting my UX head back on here. I guess really the data-driven and the KPIs and taking measurements is so, so important. Whether I'd be working with a company on a website or on a product or on a process or a smart city initiative, it is so important to take measurements and then come back to them to see what difference we're actually making. So I guess then UX, a transformational tool in urban design? I absolutely think so. And I think that context that I showed you beforehand, that idea now that we have a UX urban design or UX urban designer, I think we're going to see more and more of that over the coming years as city planners, architects, municipalities and local authority actually turn to the design world to be able to make better decisions. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. And I shall, please feel free to link with me on LinkedIn, on Twitter, I'm Helena Hill UX CX. And thank you very much.